So far in our Eras of 40k series, we've talked about the Emperor's early life during the Age of Terra, we've talked about humanity prospering and exploring the galaxy during the Dark Age of technology. We've discussed the Age of Strife, that old night which followed, and more recently, we've talked about the Horus Heresy which happened during the Age of Darkness. The time period that follows the Age of Darkness is officially called the Age of the Imperium, but before we can go over that, we have to go back in time. We've been going over the far future in Warhammer 40k, but for this video, we are going to go into the far past of the 40k setting, before the Space Marines, before the Primarchs, before the Emperor, before Earth. We are going to go back to a time I want to call the Primordial Age, a time in Warhammer 40k where godlike aliens and cosmic powers ruled the galaxy millions of years before humanity ever came into being. Hello everyone, I am Inquisitor Vuln and I make videos deep diving into the lore of the 40k universe. If that's something that you're into, please like and subscribe for more content. In this video, we are going to talk about the alien time before humanity, the origin story to basically half of the Xenos factions in Warhammer 40k. There is an element of cosmic horror to the Warhammer 40k universe. Cosmic horror is a subgenre of sci-fi coined by H.P. Lovecraft, which is why it's also sometimes referred to as Lovecraftian horror. It's characterized by focusing on the vast unknown of deep space and the total indifference of any entities that would exist in space toward humanity. It is also characterized by the madness that thinking about this reality could imbue on the psyche of humanity. Warhammer 40k is a setting that is essentially defined by the concept of cosmic horror, and in this video, it is my goal to show that to you. Let us begin. The oldest sentient entities in the physical universe of Warhammer 40k are beings that are referred to as the C'tan, also pronounced Catan and Kurtan. The C'tan, also called the Ingir by the Eldar, came into existence when the universe itself came into existence. Think about the Big Bang, our universe forming, all of the atoms violently clashing into each other, forming into molecules, and molecules forming into different states of matter, solids, liquids, gases, and plasmas, supercharged by energy, all producing energy, being brought together by gravity, being broken apart by force, all causing reaction, swirling and forming into stars, nebula, cosmic debris that would form into asteroids and planets and so on. This is the beginning, physical reality in its most primordial state of formation. The C'tan came into existence during this time. They were beings made of raw energy that somehow achieved a level of sentience, of subjective experience that were sustained by consuming energy. With their primal form of self-awareness, they were able to determine that stars gave off the most energy, and so C'tan would spread themselves over the surface of stellar bodies and feed off the energy that was being emitted until the star died an early death, either collapsing into a white dwarf or a black hole, or else exploding in supernova. From there, the C'tan would use the force of electromagnetism to travel across space until it found another star to feed on. The C'tan were basically cosmic energy vampires. Though they fed off of stars to the point of destroying them, if not for the C'tan, other stars would not be created. The formation of some of those stars would eventually lead to solar systems and planets that would eventually be able to sustain life. In a way, the C'tan were the first real gods of material reality, were the first true embodiments of the forces of nature, the original Titans. This is why it would make sense that they would later be called the Star Gods. The C'tan were uninterested in consuming physical matter at this time, which by itself did not give off enough energy for them. The energy emitted from stars became their primary diet, and they generally preferred the oldest stars in our galaxy, found in its most outer fringes. Just by the C'tan carrying out their natural function, solar systems would be created. One solar system in particular, in the northern rim of our galaxy, would host a planet that would sustain life. On that unknown, unnamed planet, molecules would combine and chemical reactions would occur to the point where life would come into being. Of the life forms that would emerge into existence, the first life forms to gain sentience would be creatures known to us in the 40k lore as the Old Ones. In the 40k universe, the Old Ones are the first physical living species to gain sentience in our galaxy. They are described as ancient, long-lived, cold-blooded creatures, but descriptions of them are lacking because few actually saw them that are still alive to tell it in the modern setting. We don't know how the Old Ones looked, with one description being that they appeared amphibian-like, but we might have clues. One species of Xenos that would eventually come into being would be called the Slan. The Slan were suggested to be the devolved offshoot of the Old Ones. It may have been the first species that they created. And if we look at the available lore for the Slan Xeno species, there were figures that were called Slan High, which other species called the Old Ones, and this confirms that the Slan were either descended from or were the earliest creations of the Old Ones. If we could base their appearance on available sources in the Warhammer universe overall, including other settings in the Warhammer universe in which Slan exist, we could determine that the Old Ones ranged from amphibian to reptilian in appearance. The term Old Ones is used as a generalized statement unintentionally. The immensely powerful psychic beings known as the Old Ones and the Slan, the first species that the Old Ones would create, are both collectively called the Old Ones by all the species that would come into existence after them, but there is a difference between the Old Ones and the Slan. According to what information I could find, the true Old Ones were a peaceful and creative species who were technologically advanced and psychically powerful. Their main priority was to travel across the galaxy, planting habitable worlds with life and nurturing those life forms into sentience and intelligence. It is said that the Old Ones retired to the northern rim of the galaxy well before many of the other species they created would evolve into being, yet every species created later on would interact with beings that they called the Old Ones. For all intent and purpose, the Slan were the Old Ones to everyone else because they came first. Most, if not all, of the species created by the Old Ones were psychic species, meaning that they had an impact on and presence in the realm known as the Warp, the energetic undercurrent of physical reality that was likely created when the Old Ones came into existence. Most of these species would intentionally or unintentionally create warp entities and gods, psychic intelligences in the warp that were given power by the beings that created them. The more the warp was influenced, the more it became the realm of chaos, the raw emotion of sentient species who would have an imprint on the warp to the degree that it would create its own ecosystem on the other side of reality. It is for this reason that the Old Ones designed the Webway, a network of pathways constructed by psychic energy to be separate from the chaotic realm of the warp. The Webway would serve as a means of travel across the vast distance of the galaxy in far less time than it would take in real space, and in a much more stable way than traveling through the warp would take. Most of the species that came into existence after the Old Ones did so under their stewardship. The majority of these species would come into existence and fade away to be unknown to the species that would later exist. There was one species that came into existence by themselves, without the guidance of the Old Ones. These were known as the Necrontyr. The Necrontyr were a species that evolved into sentience and intelligence on a world in the northeastern rim of the galaxy. They were a species that was not created by the Old Ones, but by the slow workings of time and natural evolution. No one truly knows how the Necrontyr looked in their ancient past, but most theoretical depictions are based on a reversal of their current state, in which they were a tall, humanoid, and skeletal species that stood around 8 to 9 feet tall, with possibly gray speckled skin, possibly burnt darkened skin, because of the environment they evolved in. The system star on which their planet's life depended on was highly unstable. Though their world was apparently close and yet far enough to sustain life, the star let out far higher amounts of radiation than normal. This created a melancholy condition for the Necrontyr as a species. They lived short lives filled with pain and sickness as their system star imbued them with cancer and various physical ailments. Though they adapted to the irradiated environment to the point that it didn't kill them outright or seize all life, it still shortened their lives significantly. This reality shaped their culture. They became obsessed with death. Their cities were basically cities of the dead, where statues, monuments, and actual mausoleums were erected as grim reminders of their inevitable fate. The Necrontyr divided themselves into different dynasties, each organized by a strict hierarchy and ruled by a noble family. Necrontyr society was ruled by the Triarch, 3 pharaohs of the most powerful dynasties, with the most powerful being the Silent King. Infighting and competition amongst the dynasties was common and sanctioned as part of Necrontyr culture so long as it followed the dynastic codes of conduct, which outlined how conflict was to be engaged in according with traditional standards. Despite their short lives and near constant infighting, the Necrontyr developed into a technologically advanced civilization, and they focused their efforts on finding ways to escape their system and its star. Eventually, they would create a self-repairing living metal called necrodermis. Using it, they would create the dynastic torch ships with inbuilt stasis crypts so that they could survive the long travel across the stars. Unlike the old ones and the species they would create, the Necrontyr were not a psychic species. They had no presence in the warp, no souls, and they could not influence or be influenced by the warp. They also did not know or have access to the Webway network, so their travel across the galaxy in these torch ships was slow and ponderous. The Necrontyr would spread across the galaxy slowly, establishing themselves on various life-sustaining worlds and subjugating other species they encountered. The lore says that at this point, the Necrontyr would encounter the Old Ones, and, observing their long lives and perpetual good health, would ask them for the secrets to long life and immortality. For one reason or another, the Old Ones would refuse to give this knowledge to the Necrontyr. This would lead to conflict between the two species. What followed after this rejection would be a galaxy-spanning war, and a war that the Necrontyr would initially lose. In response to the Necrontyr wanting war against them, the Old Ones bioengineered a new species, the Orkoids. The Orkoids, or the Orcs, were a green-skinned, semi-fungus-based life form created for the sole purpose of war. They were aggressive, violent, and physically imposing, made with the ability to make a weapon out of anything, and a gestalt psychic power that increased in strength the more orcs gathered in an area. Orcs gave off spores wherever they were, which meant that even if orcs died through conflict, the orc spores it gave off while alive had the potential to grow into more orcs. Using the Webway to rapidly assault the Necrontyr settlements and utilizing their psychic strength over their enemy, the Old Ones and the Orcs fell upon the Necrontyr worlds with superior technology and their aggression, forcing the entire species to abandon the world they had settled on and retreat back to their homeworld in the Halo stars. Back on their homeworld, having lost a war and embittered, the Necrontyr dynasties would engage each other in civil war until a discovery was made. The Necrontyr were able to detect a Satan feeding off of their system's star, and were soon able to detect others feeding from stars nearby. Still vengeful from their defeat by the Old Ones, the Necrontyr saw these entities as potential weapons. The technologists of the Necrontyr would create vessels, bodies made of living metal necrodermis, shaped in the visage of the old Necrontyr gods, for the Satan to inhabit, hoping that these cosmic entities would help them in their fight against the forces of the Old Ones. The Necrontyr were mistaken. The first of these living metal bodies to be inhabited was the one representing Azagorod, the Necrontyr god of death. It was inhabited by the Satan that was feeding off of their system's star. Once trapped in a body of necrodermis, Azagorod would slaughter thousands of Necrontyr and feed off the energy emitted from their deaths. Only immediate supplication and widespread sacrifice would stay its wrath from devouring the entire species. The second necrodermis shell to be inhabited was that of Mephitran, the golden messenger god of the Necrontyr pantheon. There would be others, old gods and new, but these first two star gods would change the future of the Necrontyr for all eternity. While the first, Azagorod, would become something of a representative of the Necrontyr, the second would claim to be able to show them the key to immortality. Essentially, Mephitran the Messenger instructed the Necrontyr on how to use the technology that they themselves had created, necrodermis, to become immortal. All they would need to do is transfer their consciousness into the necrodermis machines, and not only would they be immortal, but they would also be practically impervious, especially since necrodermis had self-healing properties. Following its instructions, the Silent King, Zarek, would command biofurnaces to be created, and Necron-tier citizens would be dragged into them, their bodies being destroyed and their consciousness transformed into android bodies of necrodermis through arcane and eldritch means. Technically speaking, the star god Mephitran didn't lie. The Necron-tier were now immortal and impervious, but they would now only be tools to be used. Any potential for the development of a soul was taken from them as a species. Their existence was a form of damnation. Mephitran became known as the Deceiver, and the Necron-tier became the Necrons, an empire of android machines controlled by the command protocols of the Silent King, but tied to the will of the Satan. What followed would be a conflict which was called the War in Heaven. This was essentially when the Necrons arose again to fight the Old Ones, and this time the Necrons would have the upper hand. The War in Heaven was a galaxy-spanning battle between the forces of the Old Ones and the Necron dynasties under the command of the Satan Star Gods. Whereas before, the Old Ones were able to have an upper hand over the Necron-tier, now that they had become the Necrons, the tables had turned. At this point in time, the Necrons were under the control and direction of the Satan, who had used the Necrons to harvest entire species that the Old Ones had nurtured into existence, feeding off the life essence that was expended at their deaths. In the face of such a threat, the Old Ones transformed the Orcs into the Krorks, larger, stronger, more intelligent, and more technologically inclined Orcs in order to battle against the Necrons. In combination with this upgrade, the Old Ones created new species to be able to fight the Necrons and their reality-bending star gods. Chief amongst these species were the Eldar, or the Eldari, tall, thin, humanoid Xenos that were psychically powerful, spiritually immortal, and extremely intelligent. Also created during this time were species like the Jakairo, primate-like Xenos with orange hair that were extremely intelligent and technologically creative, the Hrud, strange, time-bending Xenos, and other species only known by name, such as the Knib and the Rashan. It took the creation and combined effort of all of these species and the gods that they would create in the warp to be an equal match for the Necrons and the Satan, and when I say equal, it was barely that. The Satan were terrors upon the galaxy, and with the Necrons at their command, they had an army of deathless androids to protect and fight for them. Though Necron technology had far advanced past what it had been before, and their fleets were no longer torch ships but vessels that could travel at the speed of light, they still couldn't traverse the galaxy like the Old Ones could. It would be the Satan known as the Burning One that would create the means for the Necrons to enter the webway through their use of living stone portals called Dolmen Gates. This turned the tide against the forces of the Old Ones. It would be the invention of the Dolmen Gates that secured the technical victory of the War in Heaven to the Satan and the Necrons. But a few things would happen to discredit that victory. With everything going on, the psychic species created by the Old Ones were upsetting the warp with their fears and other emotions. More and more over time, the warp became a realm of chaos, and certain entities and species that lived in the warp grew in strength and power. One such species was the Enslavers. Technically a kind of species that lived in the warp, enslavers fed upon psychic beings in physical reality through their minds. Using the minds of their prey as an anchor, the enslavers would use the bodies of their prey as portals into physical reality. Once this happened, enslavers would enter reality, becoming physical beings that controlled the minds of their prey's population, turning them into zombies basically. There was a period in time near the ending of the War in Heaven when there was something called the Enslaver Plague. During the Enslaver Plague, the species created by the Old Ones became prey to the Enslavers, turning against their creators and attacking the strongholds of the Old Ones. This plague was so widespread that the majority of the Old Ones fled our galaxy in order to survive, with some of them going into hiding. When the Enslaver Plague happened, the Necrons were safe, with them being android machines and not living beings, but the Enslavers began feeding on the life forms that the Satan fed on for sustenance, and that was a problem. It is unclear about why it would happen. Perhaps it was the enslaver plague that pushed them to do it. Other sources say that it was the manipulation of the deceiver for its own entertainment. There are even some theories that say it was the bidding of one of the Eldari gods. But whether due to a lack of sustenance or the result of a strategic ploy by their enemy, the Satan began to consume each other. The Nightbringer was the most ravenous of the Satan, who had annihilated entire sectors of space in order to feed. So when it tasted the essence of the other Satan, it became a cannibal, devouring many of his own kind to the point that only a few Satan remained active in the galaxy. Though this would make the Nightbringer more powerful, it would make the Necrons weaker, as less Satan meant less weapons against the forces of the Old Ones. Zarek, Silent King of the Necrons, had some regrets about what he had allowed to happen to his species in the pursuit of immortality. Now they were basically slaves of the living gods that they had brought into existence. So, during this time of turmoil amongst the Satan, the Necrons orchestrated a decisive strike against the remaining star gods. The Necrons created hypercannons that would not only breach the Satan necrodermis bodies, but tear apart their energetic-based forms to the point that the Satan would be broken into shards, pieces of their once whole self. These pieces would not be as powerful as their previous state, and some pieces wouldn't even be aware of who or what they once were. In this form, the Satan were now subservient to the Necrons, placed into devices called Tesseract Vaults to be more directly used as weapons and tools of war as was originally intended. The Necrons obtained a degree of autonomy back as a species by enslaving their own gods. However, because the Satan were living gods, embodiments of universal forces to a degree, their reduction into shards impacted not only the Necrons, but reality itself. A madness would take root in the Necron consciousness when the Satan were destroyed and reduced, a madness that would show itself millions of years later. These two events, the Enslaver Plague and the enslaving of the Satan by the Necrons, basically concluded the war in heaven. The Old Ones had abandoned the galaxy, the species they had created were drastically reduced and struggling against the Enslaver Plague. The Necrons had won. But Zarek, in his wisdom, saw that one of the species that the Old Ones had created had potential, the Eldar, who were not only fighting back against the enslavers, but were spiritually immortal in that their souls would eventually be reincarnated on the physical plane of existence. Zarek saw that the Eldar would be an issue for the Necrons. Instead of continuing to fight them in open combat, the Silent King decided to weaponize time against his enemies. The Eldar might be long-lived, but they were not immortal in the same way that the Necrons were. So, Zarek commanded the various Necron dynasties into the Great Sleep, during which the Necrons would descend into the catacombs of their hidden tomb worlds scattered across the galaxy, placing themselves in stasis for millions of years, during which time their enemies, the Eldar, would have their wax and wane of power and dominance over the galaxy. The Silent King of the Necrons would then leave this galaxy, traveling into the Outer Dark for unknown reasons. But before he left, in a final act of redemption, he removed his command protocols from the Necrons. When the dynasties would arise again, millions of years into the future, they would arise with any free will that they had left to determine their own fate as they once were able to do when they once lived. It would be the Eldari that would rule the galaxy for millions of years after the War in Heaven, a relative time of peace and stability. Several species that the Old Ones created would not survive the War in Heaven, like the Knib and the Rashan, who appear to have been annihilated during the Enslaver Plague. The Krorks devolved back into the Orcs. The Jakiro existed peacefully in the northern rim of the Halo stars. Countless unknown Xenospecies would evolve into being and fade away with time. The Eldar were a Xenos susceptible to the extremes of emotions in response to their experiences, and they were ever curious about existence and the sensations that they could encounter. This led them to darker and darker means of experience, and because they were such a psychically powerful species, they would end up creating a new chaos god in the warp, Slaanesh, she who thirsts. Unlike the Necrons, who had no souls, the Eldari did have souls that would usually return to the warp after death, but unlike previously where they would simply be reincarnated, the god of access and pleasure Slaanesh would devour their souls. This led to a fracturing in the Eldar species into distinct groups, each trying different ways to save their souls from being devoured by Slaanesh. But just like that, the Eldar had risen in power and fell from it, just as the Silent King predicted. But by this time, millions of years had passed since the War in Heaven, and those hidden Old Ones that still remained in the galaxy were still at work in the galaxy, continuing to nurture life where they could, leading up to the time of the Age of Terra. This period of deep prehistory that I am calling the Primordial Age of Warhammer 40k is in some ways even more mythological than the Age of Terra. Any accounts of what happened in it are from those who are able to interpret the historical records of Xeno species that have existed for millions of years. It was a completely alien time, and yet what happened during it would both affect and shape humanity far into the future. For example, the biggest way that the Primordial Age shaped humanity according to available lore is that it was the Old Ones, more appropriately the Slann, that created the primate species on ancient Earth that would eventually be known as humanity. Because the Old Ones created humanity, we would evolve into a psychic species. Humans would have souls, an impact on the warp, and during their early years of existence, they would create gods and entities in the warp, similar to the Eldari and many of the other species that the Old Ones created. Some humans would develop a genetic mutation that enabled them to interact with and use the warp. Called shamans at one point and witches in another, these humans would eventually be known as psychers in the 40k setting. There would also be humans who would develop a genetic mutation called the perpetual gene, which made it so that they could not physically die. They regenerated from harm and damage, and they functionally lived forever. In the lore of Warhammer 40k, there would be but a few human beings who were born as both psychers and perpetuals. The most powerful and important of these individuals was a man who would be known by many names throughout history. Most would come to eventually know him as the Emperor of Mankind. Another example of how the Primordial Age influenced humanity was in the lore for the Dragon of Mars. We went over this lore briefly during our Age of Terra video, but during his early years on Terra, the Emperor would face a creature described as a kind of metallic dragon at least twice before he could subdue it. Much later in the lore, as humanity began to leave Earth and conquer the solar system, the Emperor would imprison the creature on the red planet of Mars, assigning an immortal guardian to its prison. The creature would communicate with its guardian through dreams. It was through these dreams that we discover that the creature imprisoned on Mars was actually a C'tan shard, the shard of Magladroth, the Void Dragon. We also find out that the Emperor of Mankind imprisoned the C'tan shard on Mars on purpose so that its dreams would influence the settlers on Mars to become more technologically inclined. Basically, the Emperor put a C'tan shard on Mars in order to create the Cult Mechanicus. As we know, the Cult Mechanicus would only arise during the Age of Strife, after the Cybernetic Revolt would bring the intergalactic federation that existed during the Dark Age of technology to its end. The Cult Mechanicus would be instrumental in the creation of the Imperium of Man through their harvesting of STCs and their hunger for technological knowledge. The Emperor would ally with Mars during the beginning of the Great Crusade, but in reality, the Emperor had already set it up so that Mars would believe him to be the Omnissiah and ally with him thousands of years before the Great Crusade by putting the Shard of Magladroth on Mars. In Warhammer 40k lore, the story of the Emperor subduing the Shard of the Void Dragon on Terra would eventually be transformed into the story of St. George and the Dragon. This was such an important accomplishment of the Emperor that he would depict it on the Eternity Gate within the Imperial Palace. While most would see a depiction of the Emperor slaying a serpent-like dragon, few would understand that it was actually representing the Emperor subduing a shard of a star god. Fewer would understand why the image was on the Eternity Gate, the gateway within the Imperial Palace that led to the Golden Throne and the entrance to the Webway project, the Webway that the Old Ones created. Knowing all of this really puts an emphasis on how important the Emperor of Mankind was, the width and depth of his knowledge of humanity's place in the cosmos. It also gives context as to what the Emperor was trying to accomplish with humanity, with the Great Crusade, and everything. With his genetic experiments and superhuman creations, he was trying to accelerate human evolution to the point that they would all become perpetuals. Homo superior, as it was called by Erda, who was another perpetual, because he knew that there were forces in the universe and in the warp that could annihilate humanity in the blink of an eye. In almost every part of human history, humanity has interacted with these cosmic alien beings. There are countless examples, and I've mentioned a lot of them in the videos previous to this in our series. Just off the top of my head though, during the Dark Age of technology, humanity had a peaceful relationship with the Eldar. The Primarch Angron was nearly killed by Dark Eldar in his youth, and Vulcan led the people of Prometheus against Dark Eldar raids. The Primarch Omegon discovered his primary weapon, the Pale Spear, on the world he landed on in the galactic south, and it was a weapon that was created before the Eldar ever existed. Humanity fought against these beings as they expanded out into the galaxy during the Great Crusade. The Ulanor campaign against one of the largest orc-claimed sectors of space liberated millions of humans from slavery. Perturabo and the Iron Warriors would be sent to face the mysterious Hrud xenospecies, which were created by the Old Ones, whose time-bending ability turned thousands of Astartes into dust. And so on, and so on, and so on. The examples of this are many. The reason why I'm talking about the Primordial Age after the Age of Darkness is that after the Horus Heresy, the Imperium was in a weakened state from which it would barely recover. With the Great Crusade over, with the Emperor of Mankind mortally wounded and bound to the Golden Throne, the Space Marine legions broken up into chapters, and human populations scattered across the galaxy isolated, humanity fell prey to these ancient horrors that existed in the universe before them. Orcs would amass great wars that would lay waste to entire solar systems. Dark Eldar would commit raids on several weak human settlements, making slaves of humanity to torture and slaughter in order to save their own souls from Slaanesh. The Silent King has returned to the galaxy, and many Necron tomb worlds scattered across the galaxy have started to awaken and annihilate humans from planets that they consider to be their own. New Xenos would come into the galaxy, attracted by events that happened during the Heresy, like the Tyranids, which devour all life indiscriminately in order to feed their own survival. Some Xenos species would be new to evolve in our galaxy and mysteriously accelerate toward technological dominance, like the Tau. The existence of aliens after the Horus Heresy and humanity's struggle to survive against them became a pillar of the Warhammer 40k setting after the Age of Darkness. And perhaps the scariest part of all of this is that the ancient primordial beings that existed millions of years before humanity will likely exist after humanity. The Emperor was never able to accomplish his goal of accelerating the evolution of the human species to the point that they would become perpetuals. Every other species that exists in the galaxy will live longer than humanity, they are stronger and older than humanity, and they have abilities that humanity does not have. Humanity in Warhammer 40k is literally fighting a losing battle for survival, and it is that grimdark reality that makes Warhammer 40k and the Age of the Imperium what it is. As a final note, I would say that the loudness of the Imperium of Man makes sense, especially during the Great Crusade. The proud colors and heraldries, the amount of resources that went into monuments and statues, all of the gold and boisterous armor, the immense ship classes, and conviction of the imperial truth, all of the noise, all of the business of the Imperium, it was and is the equivalent of a scream into the dark of an indifferent universe that, with the shift of its being, can make it so that it would appear as if humanity never existed at all. Thank you all for watching. As always, I had a really fun time diving into this aspect of 40k history, and I hope that you enjoyed it as well as learned something new. If you did and you haven't done so already, please like and subscribe for more content. And if you have hobby friends who you think would enjoy this video, please share it with them, as it helps the channel grow and I would appreciate it. Without anything else to say, Inquisitor Vuln out. Remember, the Emperor protects and the future is successor.